There are individuals who seem to carry themselves through emotionally charged situations without being visibly disturbed. They don't flinch in the face of confrontation, and they don't spiral when someone withdraws affection or disapproval. Their calm isn't performative, nor is it rooted in detachment. It's something else entirely, something built over time through careful self-examination and psychological integration. Carl Jung believed that this kind of resilience is not innate. It is earned through an uncomfortable but necessary confrontation with the unconscious. He observed that most people are emotionally volatile, not because they feel too much, but because they understand too little of what they feel. Their internal landscape is full of unacknowledged tensions, conflicts, and projections. They mistake their immediate emotional reactions for reality, unaware that much of what destabilizes them originates from parts of the psyche they've disowned or ignored. Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious repository of what the ego refuses to accept. And until that material is faced, it leaks into every area of life, shaping relationships, decisions, and identity in ways people rarely understand. Those who develop emotional resilience do so not by hardening themselves, but by making themselves whole. The process is not glamorous. It doesn't yield quick results. But for those who follow it, the result is clarity, an inner solidity that cannot easily be manipulated from the outside. The hidden target on your chest. Emotional pain is not arbitrary. When a person feels disproportionately wounded by a particular comment, gesture, or rejection, it is often because that moment has struck something unresolved within them. The pain is real, but its roots often lie elsewhere, earlier, deeper, and rarely conscious. Jung described emotional complexes as autonomous entities within the psyche, bundles of affect and memory that react independently of the ego. These complexes behave like internal landmines. One can live for years without noticing them, until someone unintentionally steps on one, and the explosion that follows seems completely out of proportion. This is why a person might respond to a casual slight with inexplicable rage or collapse into shame after a seemingly benign failure. The situation is merely a trigger. The charge was already there. The mistake most people make is assuming that these responses define who they are. But from a Jungian perspective, they are symptoms of an inner conflict, a signal that part of the psyche has been split off and remains unacknowledged. Jung famously wrote that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct one's life, and one will call it fate. What he meant is that emotional reactivity often masquerades as destiny, when in fact it is unresolved inner material operating beneath awareness. The starting point of resilience is not control over external circumstances. It is the capacity to notice, with precision, where one is being emotionally hijacked, and to trace that reaction back to its psychic origin. The mask that fails under pressure. Every person constructs a social identity, a persona, that allows them to function within society. This persona is not inherently false, but it is selective. It highlights traits that are rewarded by the environment: kindness, competence, confidence, while suppressing those that may lead to conflict or disapproval. The problem arises when individuals begin to identify too fully with this constructed image. In doing so, they create a psychological split between who they appear to be and who they actually are. Anger, selfishness, doubt, envy, any trait that doesn't fit the persona, is relegated to the shadow. But repression does not equate to elimination. These disowned traits persist, often manifesting indirectly. The person who prides themselves on being calm may suppress their anger until it surfaces through passive aggression or sudden outbursts. The generous individual may harbor resentment that builds over time and erupts in disproportionate frustration. Jung warned that what is repressed in the self will eventually appear in the world as if it were fate. In other words, when individuals fail to acknowledge and integrate parts of their own psyche, they begin projecting those elements onto others. They may interpret others as cruel, selfish, or hostile, not because it is true, but because they are unconsciously encountering aspects of themselves that they have disavowed. This is not merely a philosophical point, it has practical consequences. An individual who cannot tolerate the idea of their own weakness will constantly feel humiliated by others. Someone who denies their own desire for control will feel chronically oppressed. Emotional resilience then begins with a process of depersonalization, recognizing that one's reactions are often reflections of internal division, not objective truths about others. The weight of unlived history. Not all emotional material originates in personal experience. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious introduces the idea that certain emotional and symbolic structures are inherited, not learned. These archetypes, such as the mother, the outcast, the warrior, the trickster, exist across cultures and time periods and shape our internal narratives in subtle but powerful ways. When individuals find themselves overwhelmed by emotional responses that seem larger than the situation calls for, it is often because these archetypal forces have been activated. The pain is real, but its scale and tone suggest that it taps into something much older than the current context. A breakup may not only feel like loss, it may activate a deep, mythic experience of abandonment. A failure may not just bruise the ego, it may awaken the archetype of the fallen hero, plunging the person into a crisis of identity. In such cases, trying to reason one's way out of pain is ineffective because the pain is not rational. It is symbolic. It belongs to the emotional architecture of the psyche, not the narrative logic of the ego. Jung believed that the only way to gain autonomy in such moments is to recognize the difference between what is personal and what is archetypal, to know when one is feeling the weight of one's own story, and when one is carrying the burden of something larger, inherited, and impersonal. This recognition creates space. It allows the person to experience the emotion without being completely overtaken by it. And in that space, a different kind of choice becomes possible. Integration as a psychological immune system. Individuation is Jung's term for the process by which a person becomes whole, not by eliminating conflict, but by bringing all parts of the psyche into conscious relationship. This includes the ego, the shadow, the anima or animus, and eventually the archetype of the self. It is not a process of improvement, but of internal reordering. Most people seek control over emotions by denying or managing them externally. But Jung argued that true psychological strength comes from integration, the willingness to know one's own destructive potential without needing to act on it. When the shadow is acknowledged and absorbed, its power to hijack consciousness diminishes. This kind of psychological integration does not produce emotional numbness. Rather, it results in emotional clarity. The person who has done this work still feels, sometimes intensely, but their reactions are no longer dictated by unresolved conflicts or hidden needs. Their emotions are contextualized within a larger internal system that has been brought into balance. They no longer need to defend against criticism because they understand their own limitations. They don't require constant validation because they have confronted the parts of themselves that once craved it. And when confronted with manipulation or chaos, they do not collapse or overcompensate because they are no longer fragmented. This is what emotional resilience looks like. Not a mask of control, but a stable center built from the raw materials of one's own complexity. The quiet force of psychological coherence. There is a kind of presence that cannot be faked. It's not rooted in charm, volume, or persuasion. It comes from a psyche that is no longer divided against itself. Individuals who reach this state often don't talk about it. They don't need to explain themselves or prove anything to anyone. Their calm is not a tactic. It is a byproduct of depth. They have sat with their own inadequacies long enough that no one else's accusations land with the same force. They've confronted their selfishness, their aggression, their longing to be loved at all costs, and in doing so, they have become difficult to manipulate. This does not make them invincible, but it does make them inwardly consistent. And in a culture where most people are emotionally scrambled, alternating between repression and reactivity, this kind of coherence is its own form of quiet power. To become emotionally resilient in the Jungian sense is not to transcend emotion, but to be able to hold it, to stay conscious inside of it without being pulled apart. It is the kind of strength that cannot be borrowed, taught, or imitated. It must be built piece by piece in the one place no one else can go: inside.